Hi, and welcome to week number 2 of our current Bible study series on the book of Revelation. So we have titled this Bad Readings of Revelation. It's not that we're trying to teach you wrong ways to do it. We're simply trying to look at a couple of different topics that kind of, how is it that we are approaching Revelation, and are we doing it correctly? Because I don't know if you know this, there's a lot of bad ways out there. And so we're so glad to have you with us today. And so what we're going to do today is I'm going to go ahead and set some groundwork, and then we're going to get into our topic for today. But we just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page as we continue through our study. And so today I want to start with that first setting of the stage. Is that whether you want to go ahead and pause this, or to either reflect and journal yourself or discuss with somebody else that you're doing this Bible study with. But at this time I want you to go ahead and I want you to think about, is that what is it that you know about the book of Revelation just before even reading it? And then what would you say that the message of Revelation is about? What's its message? What's its purpose? What is it trying to communicate? So go ahead and take a moment or two to go ahead and try to prime your mind thinking, what is the very purpose of this book? So, what'd you come up with? When you think about these very things in Revelation, I think many is that immediately what pops to mind is that, okay, we're talking about the end times, or we're talking about the end of the world. We're talking about those last days. We're now all of a sudden beginning to think about all of those things that are yet to come, and all of those things that are out there somewhere in the future that maybe you believe right now they're going ahead and taking place. Now, in the broad scheme, we at least need to go ahead and stop and reflect, is that how do we see this as not just a book of the future, but a book of the past and the present as well? Because as we begin to go ahead and think a little bit deeper about not only what is in this book, but what is its message and purpose, we have to at least wrestle with that fact about when you think about the different biblical books of the Bible, is that of the various books of the Bible, how much agreement is there within scholars, theologians, and even everyday believers about the message of this book of Revelation? Do you think that there's kind of a common reality of this is what we believe it means? Us together, we have an agreement on this. Or do we often see that Revelation is that book that in many ways separates us greatly from one another as fellow Christians and believers? Is that in so many ways is that we see ourselves when we come to Revelation, is that even Christians and churches that many times agree with one another on so many things, all of a sudden find a great divide when it comes to Revelation. Is that there's one Bible commentary that I love to utilize, I love to quote, is that it's not only practical but academic, is that it gets the meaning of the text, but it actually applies it to your life. But I have to admit, anytime that I get to the book of Revelation or some of those apocalyptic portions of Daniel or some of the judgment last day texts of the Gospels, is that I know I should just not even read it because it is so different from the very approach that I would have as a Lutheran Christian pastor, because it's just an entirely different mindset. Now, I know that this may be a little bit of a joke, but I think that this is a little bit of how we approach Revelation, is that I love this. That in the minutes, should I record this as a vigorous theological debate, or a theological discussion, or a serious ecclesiastical debate? Is that sometimes is that those who are so united on other portions of the scriptures and their interpretation here in Revelation, all of a sudden tempers flare, differences appear, and many strong opinions are had. And so let's just go ahead and pause for a second and let's think about this. How at least I approaching it as a Lutheran Christian pastor, and my understanding, along with many others, about that understanding of what is that message and purpose of Revelation. That it is a symbolic vision that brought hope and challenge to the 7 first-century Christians and every generations of Christians since. See, I agree with the Bible Project of how they present, and they do a great job of presenting what is that very purpose of Revelation. That it's meant to bring challenge and hope both to those 7 churches that received it back in the first century, but also to us today. That it's not just about the future, that it was just as much for the present of their day as it is for us today. And so it leads to that understanding is that Revelation reveals history's pattern. That every human kingdom eventually becomes like Babylon of the Old Testament and must be resisted with that power of the slain lamb. But there's a promise that Jesus will return one day to remove evil from his world and make all things new. And that is a promise that should motivate faithfulness in every generation. So the purpose of Revelation is to help encourage, challenge, create hope, to direct us to that fact that God is in charge, God is in control, and that he has a plan so we can be faithful, we can be joyous, that we can keep persevering even in the suffering, the hardship, the trials, the temptations that come with living within a world governed by sin. Not just governed by sin, but governed by sinners. And so we begin to lay that second layer. So when we think about Revelation, then how would you describe the content and imagery of the book? Then when you begin to think about what are those things that we are going to go ahead and see and experience when we get into Revelation? See, this is where I sometimes like to joke, is that, man, I love Revelation 21 and 22. It's a beautiful picture of heaven, and we have all of that joy of things yet to come, is that it gives this beautiful vision. But then all of those many chapters before, don't get me wrong, there's some glimpses of hope and promise and all of that beauty. But there is much that is talked about wars and rumors of wars and all sorts of weird beasts and weird things and all kinds of stuff going on. Is that I jokingly say that if Precious Moments wanted to go ahead and create and capture that Revelation content and imagery, it might look a little bit something like this. Is that it talks much about battles, much about judgment, much about death and suffering and pain. Is that it's kind of scary to some. Is that not only are we confused by stuff, but also we see that a third of the stars shall fall in one portion, or is that it talks about is that a third of the land is given over, to destruction, or a third of humanity, is destroyed. What is going on here? So the question is not just what is the content and imagery of that book of Revelation, but what is the purpose of that content and imagery? See, I might go ahead and draw an analogy here from one of my favorite authors. So one of my favorite authors is Flannery O'Connor. She was a Christian author from the South, as that in the middle of the 20th century, is that she wrote about all sorts of topics from racism to all sorts of other issues of humanity and good and evil and everything else. But the fact is that many people would ask her, is that why would she use such grotesque, gruesome depictions of humanity to describe and indeed to communicate her message? And so this is how she responded to those questions of those who were wondering, why would she use such over-the-top images, and why would she use such over-the-top, vivid depictions to get across her point? This is what she said. That when you can assume that your audience holds the same beliefs that you do, you can relax a little and use more normal ways of talking to it. But when you have to assume that it does not share your beliefs and understandings, then you have to make your vision apparent to shock. To the hard of hearing, you must shout. To those who are nearly blind, you must draw in large and startling figures. And that's what I think that we see here in that very understanding of, what's going on here? There we go. We're back. Is that to the hard of hearing you must shout, to those almost blind you must draw in large and startling figures. So while certainly that John is talking about difficult topics, that there will be suffering, that there will be pain, there will be problems, as there always have been in human history. Since Adam and Eve thought that they could define good and evil better than God, things have been one that has been marked by violence. People trying to rule and control and do all sorts of things wrong. And so John does draw from these different narratives. Not only does he draw from those pains and those problems that we experience out there in the world, but the very pains and problems that we see within the scriptures themselves. And so he draws some pretty startling images to help wake us from our slumber and to help get us to understand that there are things here that we need to wrestle with. And so that's where we see that understanding of that purpose and imagery. So we're talking about the revelation of Jesus given to the very servant John, is that it is one that is an apocalypse. Is that it is an apocalyptic literature, which is a special genre that comes with certain expectations. Is that it's just one of those things that I don't read a comic book the same way that I read a newspaper, that I don't read a fiction book the same way that I read a textbook, that each of these genres I approach in their own way. And so Revelation is an apocalypse. And so what's the purpose of an apocalypse? It's to give us a heavenly perspective on earthly circumstances, so that every generation of God's people can be challenged, comforted, and given hope for the future. And so it uses very key imagery. It uses very key ways of communicating the message that is there. So while certainly we understand and believe that God has given John a vision of things to come and a vision of God's work in the world, the fact is that in many ways this vision is being communicated in a way to help us grasp the concepts, that we cannot read it literalistically. See, there's the difference between taking the Bible literally and taking it literalistically. That taking the Bible literally is saying that God truly has revealed to John his message and purpose. And so John is trying to communicate truth to us. But when he uses figurative language, when he uses lots of symbolism, lots of numerology, lots of different communication devices to help communicate his message, does not mean that we simply take it for granted. Is that one of my favorite examples is that fact of when we look at the scripture and when we see Revelation, it talks about, in one passage it talks about, and locusts shall come up over the land. And some, who take the book of Revelation literalistically will say, okay, so there's these locusts that will overtake the land. We know that this is speaking symbolically and figuratively. And so what it's describing here is that it's describing Apache helicopters or some sort of other military device, that this is what's going on. Again, I don't think that's what John's doing. John is speaking figuratively and symbolically, drawing upon key ideas. So let's go ahead and let's take this one stage further. So what is the key what is the interpretive key for us to understand the imagery that is being used? So let's go ahead and think about that for just a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to flash up a picture here for you to go ahead and take a look at what it is. And I want you to say, if this same image was shown to, I don't know, Martin Luther in the 1500s, would he be able to interpret it? Is that if this same picture was shown to somebody 500 years from now, would that person be able to interpret it? That what are the interpretive keys that are necessary for you to interpret this picture? So I'll go ahead and put it up here. So first off, what is it that we see here? Is that we see a cartoon, not just a cartoon or a comic, that we see a political cartoon. And so this is a very specific genre trying to get across a very specific point. But the fact is that because we live in the day and age that we live in, that we can begin to interpret and understand based upon our knowledge of our day, our time, the way that things are communicated, for us to understand. First off, we understand that the elephant represents that very figure of the Republican Party, is that the donkey represents the figure of the Democratic Party, that it comes with that whole idea that this is a political commentary. But the fact is that we also know and understand this whole problem of what is football. Well, depending on where you're from, and depending upon your preferences, is that you can go ahead and interpret it in two different ways. So the topic is that whole idea of unity. That maybe we are all trying to get on the same page, but because we are coming at the problems from such a different way, is that we simply show up not prepared even to engage the other side in that very way. So again, would Martin Luther have been able to interpret that? Probably not. Not unless he studied our time, our culture, our very symbols that we used. The same thing with somebody 500 years from now. That unless you have the interpretive facts, that how can we interpret the symbols? So if we could apply that to Revelation, then what's the interpretive key for Revelation's imagery? Where do we turn? As I understand, you might have your study Bible that you've got some notes to the side or graphs or other things to help you. But the fact is that even those are, where did they get that kind of understanding to say, well, this is how you should understand this? Well, there are two key places. Is that the book of Revelation has more Old Testament allusions than any other book in the New Testament. That it is quoting or referencing or alluding or borrowing from all sorts of different biblical stories, biblical passages, biblical prophets or narratives or all sorts of others, and it constantly is driving you back into the Bible. So the interpretive key, when you're trying to understand a symbol, ask yourself the question, where else has this kind of thing shown up in the Old Testament? Where else has fire come up? Or where else did locusts and plagues of locusts come up? Is that where else did people of great rulers go ahead and try to just ravage entire people groups or entire faithful communities in their own ways? Again and again, Revelation is going to try to draw you back to the Old Testament to see that as much as we claim that things are new, the more they change, the more they stay the same. That we see those very patterns that keep on coming within humanity. And so that is that first interpretive key. The second interpretive key is that understanding of looking at things from the first century perspective of those living in Asia Minor during a time of tribulation or a time of tension and trial, not only with their fellow their neighbors, but also fellow leaders within their neighbors. And so we see within their communities, and even there has been some forms of persecution from even the Caesar himself, that Caesar worship and other aspects. And so that's what we see. You can study Revelation 2 and 3 and what's written to the churches to kind of get at a little bit of that understanding of what was going on in the time. But so it leads us all to that idea of don't look into the news headlines to understand Revelation. Look into the Bible itself. Because the more things change, the more they stay the same. See, I love this next one. Is that why study the book of Numbers? I mean, 36 chapters of self-centered people who whined every time they didn't get the way they want. Give us something relevant. Ooh, that one kind of hits a little close to home. That sometimes we look at the Old Testament and we might have our own chip on our shoulder, but the fact is that Revelation sees that those Old Testament books were just as relevant and to the time of those 7 churches in the first century as they are relevant to us today. Humans being humans and God seeking to have that relationship, that connection with humanity. And so that kind of leads us to that understanding of now, what is the very topic that we want to look at today? We want to look at the topic of numerology. How does Revelation use numbers in its time? And so at this time, I want you to go ahead, once again, pause, stop, journal, reflect, talk with others. Think about this. That what importance or significance do we place upon numbers within our culture today? So where are those places that maybe we make a big deal about numbers? Is that what numbers are considered lucky or unlucky within our day? Whether you believe it or not, so what are some of those lucky and unlucky numbers? And ask yourself why. Where did we come up with that? And then what are some examples of activities or practices that place a highly symbolic or superstitious meaning to numbers? So go ahead and pause and reflect. So what'd you come up with? I think as I think through this, we live in a day and age and a culture that we can have 2 opposite reactions. That there are some that would place that high understanding of numbers, that high significance in simply that there are some that approach it from the science and technology, that numbers are all that there is and there's nothing else, that should just show me the facts. But then there are others that sometimes approach numbers with a certain amount of superstition, a certain amount of just kind of that, mysterious, reality. But the fact is that when we approach it, we see that God's world is an orderly world, and therefore science and technology is certainly welcome and something that we believe in. But at the same time, we understand that there are ways that numbers can be used superstitiously, or at least what we would say, that there are ways that numbers can communicate meaning and significance without being superstitious. But so what are lucky and unlucky numbers? Maybe some of those lucky numbers, we hear things like the number 7, is that maybe, there's that favorite basketball player that we followed when we were kids. I don't know, number 23 was really big for, quite some time during my childhood. Michael Jordan, for those that don't remember, is that there's certain numbers that hold that kind of draw to us, or we might have our own lucky numbers, is that, birthdays or anniversaries or other things like that, the things that we use to sometimes, unfortunately, create our secret passcodes. We talk about those things, but what are some unlucky numbers? is that we think about that unlucky number of 13. I've heard of hotels not having a labeled 13th floor, or maybe not having a room number 13 on the floor, or stuff like that. You hear about these kind of unlucky things. Then where do we come up with this stuff? Well, in some ways, is that I've heard, well, 7 plays a big number within the Bible. I don't know if that's where kind of the luckiness comes from. Is that I've heard 13. Somebody at least said, that's the number of witches within a coven. I don't know. But again, it's just kind of, where do we come up with this stuff? And so we see some of those things. Where do we see that highly symbolic or superstitious meaning? I think that there's some that we have our fortune cookies that we get, or those lottery numbers that we choose, is that we pick all kinds of different things. Well, actually, I shouldn't say we. I've never bought a lottery ticket. But the fact is that people do all sorts of different things when it comes to those kinds of stuff. From the tarot card reality or other things, there's all kinds of superstition out there. But the fact is that within the scriptures is that there are certain numbers that, not superstitiously, but they come with a meaning. They come with a significance. And so that's where, when we come into the book of Revelation, how does the book of Revelation use numbers? It uses numbers as another communication piece to help you remember what? What was the 2 questions that we asked? How do we understand a symbolic portion of Revelation? Where else in the Bible has it been used? And what would it have meant within that ancient Near Eastern Roman Empire time frame of those first 7 congregations in Asia Minor that this was written to? And so some of those questions lead us into our text today, that they weren't some sort of code, or code of kind of like mysterious interpretation. No, once again, they were just another way of reminding us of what Scripture says and the promises of God that are there. And so we're going to go ahead and now open up to our Bible. We're going to look at a few passages that have to deal with numbers. Not the book of Numbers, but numbers in Revelation. So I'm going to grab my Bible. I invite you to go ahead and grab yours. If you want to turn to Revelation chapter 1, we're going to take a brief look at a couple of different passages, and we're going to see what it is. So lucky number 7. Let's go ahead and at least catch a little bit of that lucky number 7 in Revelation. Not that it's so much of a lucky number, but it shows up all over the place. Is that there's 7 seals, that are broken on the scroll. There's an entire 7 seal portion of the scriptures. There's also 7 bowls of wrath that are supposedly poured out upon the nations. Is that there's the 7 crowns on the 7 heads of this dragon creature that begins to be talked about in chapter 12 and 13. Again, not your normal everyday book. Is that there's the 7 lampstands there in the midst of Jesus in chapter 1. There's the 7 stars, that he holds within his hand. Is that there's the 7 trumpets that once again is another series of the judgments that are there. The 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the 7 bowls, all of these things that are there. And so the question becomes, what is the significance or meaning of the number 7? So really quickly, let's look at Revelation chapter 1, is that we're going to skip on down to verse 9 is where John begins to kind of, lay things out. But in verse 12, so we're going to skip down to there. So John turns And he says, I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his chest. The hairs of his heads were white like wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace. And his voice was like the roar of many waters. And in his hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp, 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. Now I know what you're thinking. Sounds like just another Tuesday to me. No, once again, what do we get? We get this kind of bold, vivid imagery that's here. But where else have we seen, one who glows in the midst of burnished bronze and refined fires and furnaces and flame of fire and all sorts of others, that when we let our mind run wild, where else in the scriptures have we seen one who came out of the midst of the furnace? Is that in Daniel? We hear of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego thrown into the fiery furnace by the very king of Babylon. And so now what happens? The king says, didn't we throw 3 in? Is that who is the 4th that is there? One who is like what? A son of man. And so once again, we see that fact that just as Jesus was with the very 3 in the midst of the fiery furnace, already now we begin to catch a glimpse of Jesus, not described in the way that we're used to, kind of robe, sandals, long hair. No, what do we see? We see Jesus in that exalted state, in all sorts of imagery that's trying to call out that he is powerful, strong. He has been refined. He has been perfected in all ways. And now he stands with full authority, full power, that even the very sword of the Spirit and the sword of the Word of God comes forth from his mouth. All right. So that's at least setting the scene. But so what's the deal with the 7 lampstands and the 7 stars in the midst of these things? That if we skip down to chapter 1, verse 20, is that he now helps us understand that as for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. And so he interprets it for us. But when we begin to think about this, then what is the significance of the number 7? Where do we get that significance? Where else in the Bible has the number 7 been used frequently? Now you might think about the book of Daniel is that that there's 70 weeks, or 7 times 7. There's all kinds of different stuff like that. You might think about Jesus talking about, I tell you, you are not to forgive your brother simply 7 times, but 70 times 7. You might hear some of those. But again, where are they drawing from? If we go all the way back to the beginning of the Bible of Genesis 1, where does it get its significance? That in the creation, that God's word says that the world was created in 7 days. On the 7th day, God saw all that he made, and he declared it exceedingly good. So what does that number 7 mean? That number 7 is a number of completion. It's a number of wholeness, that it is complete and full. And so though this letter of Revelation was truly sent to 7 literal churches in the at the end of the 1st century, the fact is that they not only are that wholeness of that very recipients of the letter, but not only do their angels that protect them, but the very 7 churches themselves stand for more than just completeness. They stand for the wholeness of God's church and the wholeness of God's angels. And so that's where the number 7 has this whole idea of not just being a specific number, but a whole, a part of a whole that's there, a comprehensive, universal. And so that's where we begin to see that. And so when we look at the structure of the book of Numbers, what do we begin to see? We begin to see 7 seals and 7 trumpets and 7 signs and 7 bowls. Now these three are those that this is where that judgment is brought. And what do we see? We don't see 3 different kind of judgments of God. We see 3 different descriptions of the same judgment that keeps leading to that final judgment of Judgment Day. And so this break in the middle of the 7 signs, once again, is that John goes ahead and breaks his pattern to go ahead and reveal this different reality of this sign that is being done, or these 7 signs that are being accomplished. So another portion of the scriptures. Let's turn really quickly to Revelation chapter 7. Now what does it mean of this 144,000 that are there? Is that it says there in the midst of things, so chapter 7 verse 4, and I heard the number of the sealed, 144,000 sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. So what do we have? We have 12 times 12 times 1,000. So where else in the scriptures have we seen the number 12? Let's start there. Once again, going back to the Bible. What do we see? Is that we see the 12 tribes of Israel. We see the 12 disciples or apostles of Jesus. And so what do we see here in the 144,000? Not only does it figuratively talk about that understanding of 12,000 from Judah, 12,000 from Reuben, from Gad and Asher and Naphtali, and it goes on to describe those tribes, but we see that understanding that we can also understand this as kind of that wholeness. That 12 tribes multiplied by 12 apostles multiplied by 1,000, a nice large round number, another number of completion, of wholeness, but kind of that big scale idea. And so the 144,000, does that mean quite literally that there will be 144,000 that will be sealed with God's name? Now once again, it appears that John is pointing us beyond this, beyond a sheer number to a bigger reality. Because what do we then see? We see right after that is that John looks and he beholds not just 144,000 that shall be welcomed into God's very kingdom, but what do we hear? A great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, who have all washed their very robes in the blood of the Lamb. And so what do we see? John taking a number and using it in a way to say that God is creating and sealing for himself a people. That not only will he care for them while they are going through their earthly trials and tribulations, the 144,000 on earth, as it describes in Revelation 7, but also the very multitude, that wholeness of all of the people of God from every tribe, every language, every nation. Now I need to go ahead and start wrapping things up a little bit. So the 144,000 shows up again in Revelation 14, but this time they're in heaven. But now here's the thing. Is it the same 144,000 or is it a different group? Once again, there's all sorts of questions that abound. But there's one other important thing that is there for us to think about when we talk about numbers within the book of Revelation. The mark of the beast. Maybe you've heard about it before. What is this mark of the beast? And what is the beast and everything else that is there? See, in Revelation 12 and 13, we get this pause, this interlude, between, we've had the, the 7 seals and 7 trumpets, I think it is, and then the bowls come later. And so we get this pause of the 7 signs, and everything else. And so, what do we begin to see is that, what have we seen there? What have been some of those proposed marks of the beast? People have said anything from, social security numbers, to all kinds of other things to go ahead and mark, this as that mark of the beast. But so let's go ahead and look at this. So let's get some context. That if you turn to Revelation chapter 12, is that really quickly I'm just going to kind of describe what happens. Is that all of a sudden that there's this picturesque imagery of this 7-headed dragon who is trying to eat the child of this woman who is described. And so there's this battle now between this serpent, snake-like creature and this offspring of this woman. Now, once again, where have we seen in the scriptures described a story, an account of the battle between a snake or snake-like creature and a woman and her offspring? Well, in Genesis 3:15, what do we hear as that promise? After Adam and Eve have listened to the serpent and said, we're going to do our way, and we're going to define evil the way we want to, and we're going to follow the serpent, what now comes as judgment? That God not only brings a word of judgment upon the man within his very realm, he brings the word of judgment upon the woman, and then he even brings it upon the serpent. And what do we hear in Genesis 3:15? We hear that the woman shall bear a seed or an offspring, and he shall crush your head, and you shall strike his heel. And so we see this very connection, one that many would say is the first prophecy or the first promise of the Messiah, of Jesus one day, who indeed would crush Satan's head, but would be struck as he himself would die upon the cross. And so what do we see in Revelation 12? We once again see a vivid imagery being depicted of Satan trying to attack the Messiah and the Messiah's people. Because what do we begin to see? The woman doesn't necessarily represent Mary, as the way that it kind of depicts is that the woman kind of stands for all of Israel, and the Messiah comes forth from all of Israel. And so we see these different things that are going on. But then in chapter 13, so this dragon-like creature now kind of recedes to the background, kind of out of sight, out of mind. But what does that very evil accuser continue to do? But manipulate and lie and work behind the scenes to seek to lead many astray from their path. So let's turn to Revelation 13. And so that's where we begin to see 2 different beasts, quote unquote, that are there. Once again, where have we seen beasts show up before in the Bible? In the book of Daniel, kingdoms are described as beasts. Is that Babylon and Persia and the Greeks and the Romans are described as beasts. That these are beast-like creatures that abuse the people, that they think that they're powerful and strong, but end up being those that are simply motivated by violence and lust and just hunger for more. That's the imagery that we have. And so we come here to the second beast. So first we have a beast that came from the sea, it said. Once again, the sea is this chaotic, tumultuous place. It's an imagery. And so we now come to the second beast. Now, I'm going to have to ask your permission or ask your forgiveness. One final thing that I'm going to show here is that I've been using in another Bible study some of the Brick Testament, Legos describing the Bible, but it's all right. So I'll just ask you to go with me. So Revelation 13, verse 11. Then I saw another beast that rose out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spoke like a dragon. I mean, doesn't he just look fantastic? Once again, what is going on with this imagery? It's wild and it's vivid. And so what do we see though? He has two horns like a lamb. Where else in the scriptures have we seen a lamb? Well, there's the lamb of Passover. And behold, the Lamb of God who has taken away the sin of the world, Jesus, right? And so it has two horns like a lamb, that it attempts to look like a lamb, and yet it spoke like a what? A dragon, like a serpent. So it may try to pass itself off, or this person or image or this group may pass itself off to be seeking what is good and right and what Jesus would want for us, but it is truly working for evil and temptation and everything else. All right, so let's continue on. Then it made the people of earth worship the first beast. It performed great and miraculous signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in the sight of the people. So I love this guy back here. I don't know if you can see it, but check this out. This guy is good. So let's just pause for a second. Where else have we seen fire be called down from the heavens? That we hear Elijah in the battle against the prophets of Baal, that he calls God to now bring down fire upon the altar, on the sacrifices, and show who God truly is. Or we think of Sodom and Gomorrah, that indeed fire comes down in judgment and wrath. And there's this whole question between good and evil and everything that is there. And so once again, this beast shall try by its strength and its attempts and its signs to lead people's allegiance to it rather than to God. And so we come to the next part. And the beast made everyone, small and large, rich and poor, free and slave, receive a mark on their right hand or upon their forehead. I love this picture also. Hand or forehead? Which one do you want? Is like the bouncer, here at the club. Just you gotta get stamped. But now, so what is this mark of the beast? See, I like to play with this whole understanding of saying we need to step out and say, okay, what is going on here? So where else have we seen a mark being placed upon the forehead and upon the hand in Scripture? Well, in Deuteronomy chapter 6, that God speaks to the people through Moses, that these commands that I give to you today, that they are to be indeed upon your lips, that when you walk along the road and when you stay at home, is that when you rise up and when you lie down, that they are to be upon your lips. When you indeed talk with your children, impress them upon your children. It says, write them upon the door frames of your house, and indeed place them upon your forehead and upon your hand. And so there are some Jews that literally, that they're called phylacteries. They're these little leather boxes that are wrapped around their hand that contain a small scroll of a scripture or something along their forehead that again was a literalistic reality of taking what God had spoken symbolically about. And so what is this mark of the beast doing? That as this Bible, the Bible Project image shows, is that it's the anti-Shema. That's what it was the Shema was that very prayer of allegiance to God. That God is my God, and I swear my promise, my faithfulness to him, that I mark him upon my forehead and upon my head, my hand, and I will continue. And so this mark of the beast is that anti-pledge to God. And so what do we see? The 666, what is that? Once again, numbers. So 777, jackpot. No, what is it that we see? 777 is a number of completion. What about 6? Does 6 complete or finish what is there? No, what do we see? It falls short. And when was mankind created? On the 6th day of creation according to the scriptures. And so therefore, what is it that's happening? Once again, this satanic, snake-like creature is seeking to lead mankind away from allegiance to God to allegiance to other things, to themselves, to satanic forces, to all sorts of different things. So once again, what is this mark of the beast? It's not your social security number. What's the mark of the beast? It's not the QR codes that we use today. Is that what is it that is here? The two beasts are those military and political powers that are constantly seeking to take over allegiance of our lives, as well as that other beast is that economic and political machine that supports that power struggle that is there. And so what does this all have to do with us? What does this all have to do with Christians? That how do we place our allegiance to God? That we live through the sufferings or the pains or the problems that may come, that though we might have to deal with struggles throughout life, that we set our eyes upon heaven, that Jesus is going to lead us through these trials, through these struggles. Be wary of anyone that would offer to be a God in place of the one true God. I hope that you've enjoyed our conversation today about Numbers and the book of Revelation. There's still many things that could be said, but I've given you quite enough. But thank you so much for joining us, and God's blessings on your week.